When Air Force One enters contested airspace, the dynamic shifts, escorts fade away. Radio voices can turn hostile. Suddenly, the most powerful office on Earth is inside a fragile aluminum tube, vulnerable to decisions from distant control towers, vulnerable to unseen fighter cockpits. This is presidential travel in a fractured world. Iran's controlled airspace is one of the most dangerous aerial corridors for any American president. Before 1979, the skies over Iran were friendly. The Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was one of America's closest allies in the Middle East. U.S. military and presidential aircraft transited Iranian airspace with ease and regularity. The country was a strategic linchpin, a stable partner in a volatile region. Richard Nixon, Jimmy Carter. Their arrivals marked by ceremony and cooperation. The flight paths were open, the communications were clear. Shared opposition to the Soviet Union, a steady flow of oil military hardware. The thought of Air Force One facing a threat from Iran was simply unimaginable. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 shattered that reality forever. The Shah was overthrown. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini returned from exile to establish the Islamic Republic. Anti-American sentiment, long simmering beneath the surface of the Shah's autocratic rule, exploded into the open. The United States was branded the Great Satan. Black and white photo of protesters outside the U.S. Embassy in Tehran in 1979. The U.S. Embassy in Tehran was overrun, and American diplomats were taken hostage, triggering a crisis that would define the relationship for generations. Suddenly, Iran was no longer a partner, it was an adversary. In the final, agonizing days of his presidency, Jimmy Carter was consumed by the Iran hostage crisis. For 444 days, 52 American diplomats and citizens had been held captive in Tehran. His presidency was defined by it, and his defeat in the 1980 election was sealed by it. As Ronald Reagan's inauguration loomed on January 20, 1981, a frantic last-minute deal was struck. The hostages would be freed. As part of the arrangement, Carter dispatched a Boeing 707 from the presidential fleet, a backup Air Force One, to fly to Tehran to retrieve the freed Americans. It was a mission of mercy, but it was also a flight into the heart of enemy territory. The aircraft, designated SAM 27000, was not carrying the president, but it was operating under his direct authority, a symbol of the office itself. As it prepared to enter Iranian airspace, the crew faced an unnerving silence. The Iranian air traffic controllers were unresponsive. The American pilots called out again and again, identifying their mission and their peaceful intent, but the radio remained dead. For several tense minutes the plane flew onward, crossing a border into a hostile sky without permission. The crew knew they were being watched. They knew that Iranian fighter jets could be scrambled at any moment. The fate of their mission and their own lives rested on the whims of the revolutionary government below. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, a voice crackled over the radio. It was an Iranian controller, his voice sharp and suspicious. The American crew calmly explained their diplomatic mission, their words chosen carefully to avoid any provocation. The Reagan administration inherited the deep animosity with Iran. The Iran-Iraq War raged throughout the 1980s. The United States found itself unofficially siding with Saddam Hussein's Iraq. U.S. naval forces clashed with the Iranian Navy in the Persian Gulf during Operation Praying Mantis. The rhetoric from both sides was fiery and uncompromising. For President Ronald Reagan, travel to allies in Asia or the Middle East meant continuing the policy of extreme caution. Iranian airspace was not just avoided, it was treated as a potential combat zone. The White House military office planned routes that gave Iran a wide, deliberate berth. During one of Reagan's trips to Asia, this policy of avoidance created dramatic challenges. The planned flight path for Air Force One involved a long, circuitous route over the Soviet Union. Flying through Soviet airspace was a complex, sensitive undertaking requiring delicate negotiations. However, as the flight progressed, an unexpected severe weather system developed along the planned route. The pilots and mission commanders faced a hard choice: fly through the storm or divert. The only viable alternative route was to the south, but that path would take Air Force One perilously close to the edge of Iranian airspace. The decision had to be made quickly. On the plane's flight deck, military aides, Secret Service agents, and the pilots huddled, weighing the risks. The storm posed a direct physical threat. The proximity to Iran posed a geopolitical threat. The pilot made the call to divert south. For several hours, Air Force One flew along the tense aerial border, its crew on high alert. U.S. military assets in the region were placed on a higher state of readiness. By the 1990s, the overt hostility of the Reagan years had been replaced by a more complex, nuanced relationship under President Bill Clinton. While the official rhetoric remained tense, especially after the Khobar Towers bombing in Saudi Arabia, linked to Iranian-backed militants, there were tentative back-channel efforts to find common ground. This new dynamic was reflected in the skies. The absolute prohibition against entering Iranian airspace began to soften, replaced by a calculated case-by-case risk assessment. The White House Military Office explored using Iranian airspace for presidential travel, but only under the most controlled and pre-approved conditions. This shift was driven by practicality. Presidential travel to Central and Southeast Asia increased, long detours around Iran became burdensome. A direct flight could save hours of flight time, reduce refueling stops, simplify complex multi-day logistics. Was the risk acceptable? Secret negotiations via intermediaries, often Swiss diplomats, sought Iran's safe passage. It was a delicate dance of concessions. During one of Clinton's Asia tours, the plan was tested. After back-channel assurances, Iran granted diplomatic clearance for Air Force One to overfly. A landmark moment, the first intentional presidential entry into Iranian airspace since 1979. But there was a catch. Iran demanded a specific narrow flight corridor and constant radio contact with their air traffic controllers. The terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, reshaped the world and American foreign policy. In their wake, President George W. Bush embarked on the global war on terror, invading Afghanistan, later Iraq. In his 2002 State of the Union address, he famously labeled Iran as part of an axis of evil Iran, Iraq, North Korea. This plunged U.S.-Iran relations into a deep freeze, erasing tentative progress from the Clinton years. Iran was cast again as an adversary, a state sponsor of terror and a potential battlefield enemy. The airspace over Iran became more dangerous than ever. With U.S. forces on two borders, Afghanistan to the east, Iraq to the west, Iran felt encircled and threatened. Its military went on high alert. For Air Force One, visiting troops in these theaters meant navigating claustrophobic, treacherous airspace. Direct routes over Iran were basically unthinkable. The administration reverted to avoidance policies of the 1980s, plotting complex, border-hugging routes. These flights were fraught with peril. Any deviation could be misread as hostile. One dramatic example: a secret Thanksgiving trip Bush made to visit troops in Baghdad in 2003, planned under a media blackout with extraordinary security. Air Force One crossed the Atlantic into the Middle East under cover of darkness, using the call sign of a regular cargo plane. President Barack Obama entered office with a promise of a new era of engagement, extending a hand to nations that had long been American adversaries. His administration pursued a dual-track policy with Iran, imposing crippling international sanctions to curb its nuclear program, opening secret diplomatic channels that would eventually lead to the 2015 nuclear deal. This complex strategy was mirrored in the skies. The official military posture stayed extremely cautious, but the diplomatic thaw created openings, including presidential air travel. The absolute red lines of the Bush era began to blur. Obama made several trips to Afghanistan. Those flights revived an old logistical and security dilemma. The shortest, fastest route flew directly over Iran. The alternative added hours and complexity. On select occasions, the administration sought and received permission for Air Force One to use Iranian airspace. It was not a simple decision. It was a calculated, trust but verify risk based on fragile diplomacy. One flight to Bagram became a case study in cautious cooperation. After diplomatic clearance, Air Force One entered Iranian airspace. Protocol was rigid. The plane stayed in a narrow aerial highway. American pilots used formal, scripted radio exchanges with Iranian controllers, but this time there was also a direct, high-level back channel. Officials at the State Department, Swiss intermediaries, the Iranian Foreign Ministry. The presidency of Donald Trump heralded a dramatic and confrontational reversal in U.S.-Iran policy. He unilaterally withdrew the United States from the 2015 nuclear deal, calling it the worst deal ever, and reimposed devastating sanctions as part of a maximum pressure campaign. The rhetoric between the two nations escalated to alarming levels. The downing of a U.S. RQ-4 Global Hawk drone by Iran in 2019 brought the two countries to the brink of military conflict. In this supercharged atmosphere, the idea of Air Force One flying anywhere near Iranian airspace became completely untenable. The skies over Iran were once again a hard no-fly zone. This policy was put into sharp relief during President Trump's own surprise visits to troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. The logistics of these trips became more complicated and dangerous than ever before. Flight planners had to devise routes that were not only circuitous but also unpredictable, to avoid creating a pattern that could be anticipated. For his 2018 Christmas visit to Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq, Air Force One again flew under total secrecy, and with its lights blacked out. The flight path was a closely guarded secret, following the U.S. assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. In January 2020, Iran retaliated by launching ballistic missiles at U.S. bases in Iraq. In the chaotic hours that followed, Iranian air defense forces, on high alert for an American counterattack, mistakenly shot down Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752, killing all 176 people on board. The history of Air Force One's encounters with Iranian airspace is a mirror reflecting the turbulent relationship between the two nations. From the open skies of the Shah's era to the hostile silence of the revolutionary years, from the cautious cooperation of diplomatic thaws to the outright danger of the maximum pressure era, the flight path of the presidential jet has served as a barometer of U.S.-Iran relations. Each flight, rerouted by 1,000 miles or flown through a carefully negotiated corridor, told a story of mistrust risk and the ever-present potential for conflict. These incidents were more than just footnotes in presidential travel logs. They were real-world tests of nerve and diplomacy. These airborne dramas have had a lasting impact. They forced the evolution of presidential security, driving the White House Military Office and the Secret Service to develop incredibly complex contingency plans. The need to avoid or manage passage through Iranian airspace has reshaped diplomatic logistics, adding cost, time, and risk. It has reinforced deep institutional caution across the U.S. government, because planners must always account for a worst-case scenario where a misunderstanding at 40,000 feet could trigger war on the ground. The story of Air Force One in Iran is far from over.